This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scott Hinkle. The Autobiography of Mother Jones by Mother Jones. Chapter 2. The Haymarket Tragedy. From 1880 on, I became wholly engrossed in the labor movement. In all the great industrial centers, the working class was in rebellion. The enormous immigration from Europe crowded the slums, forced down wages, and threatened to destroy the standard of living fought for by American working men. Throughout the country, there was business depression and much unemployment. In the cities, there was hunger and rags and despair. Foreign agitators who had suffered under European despots preached various schemes of economic salvation to the workers. The workers asked only for bread and a shortening of the long hours of toil. The agitators gave them visions. The police gave them clubs. Particularly the city of Chicago was the scene of strike after strike, followed by boycotts and riots. The years preceding 1886 had witnessed strikes of the lake seamen, of dock laborers, and street railway workers. These strikes had been brutally suppressed by policemen's clubs and by hired gunmen. The grievance on the part of the workers was given no heed. John Bonfield, inspector of police, was particularly cruel in the suppression of meetings where men peacefully assembled to discuss matters of wages and hours. Employers were defiant and open in their expression of their fears and hatreds. The Chicago Tribune, the organ of the employers, suggested ironically that the farmers of Illinois treat the tramps that poured out of the great industrial centers as they did other pests, by putting strychnine in the food. The workers started an agitation for an 8-hour day. The trades unions and the Knights of Labor endorsed the movement, but because many of the leaders of the agitation were foreigners, the movement itself was regarded as foreign and as un-American. Then the anarchists of Chicago, a very small group, espoused the cause of the 8-hour day. From then on, the people of Chicago seemed incapable of discussing a purely economic question without getting excited about anarchism. The employers used the cry of anarchism to kill the movement. A person who believed in an 8-hour working day was, they said, an enemy to his country, a traitor, an anarchist. The foundations of government were being gnawed away by the anarchist rats. Feeling was bitter. The city was divided into two angry camps. The working people on one side, hungry, cold, jobless, fighting gunmen and police clubs with bare hands. On the other side, the employers, knowing neither hunger nor cold, supported by the newspapers, by the police, by all the power of the great state itself. The anarchists took advantage of the widespread discontent to preach their doctrines. Orators used to address huge crowds on the windy, barren shore of Lake Michigan. Although I never endorsed the philosophy of anarchism, I often attended the meetings on the lake shore, listening to what these teachers of a new order had to say to the workers. Meanwhile, the employers were meeting. They met in the mansion of George M. Pullman on Prairie Avenue or in the residence of Wirt Dexter, an able corporation lawyer. They discussed means of killing the 8-hour movement, which was to be ushered in by a general strike. They discussed methods of dispersing the meetings of the anarchists. A bitter cold winter set in. Long unemployment resulted in terrible suffering. Red lines increased. Soup kitchens could not handle the applicants. Thousands knew actual misery. On Christmas Day, hundreds of poverty-stricken people in rags and tatters, in thin clothes, in wretched shoes paraded on fashionable Prairie Avenue before the mansions of the rich, before their employers, carrying the black flag. I thought the parade an insane move on the part of the anarchists, as it only served to make feeling more bitter. As a matter of fact, it had no educational value whatever, and only served to increase the employers' fear, to make the police more savage, and the public less sympathetic to the real distress of the workers. The 1st of May, which was to usher in the 8-hour day uprising, came. The newspapers had done everything to alarm the people. All over the city there were strikes and walkouts. Employers quaked in their boots. They saw a revolution. The workers in the McCormick Harvester Works gathered outside the factory. Those inside who did not join the strikers were called scabs. Bricks were thrown. Windows were broken. The scabs were threatened. Someone turned in a riot call. The police without warning charged down upon the workers, shooting into their midst, clubbing right and left. Many were trampled under horses' feet. Numbers were shot dead. Skulls were broken. Young men and young girls were clubbed to death. The Pinkerton Agency formed armed bands of ex-convicts and hoodlums and hired them to capitalists at $8 a day to picket the factories and incite trouble. On the evening of May 4th, the anarchists held a meeting in the shabby, dirty district known to later history as Haymarket Square. All about were railway tracks, dingy saloons, and the dirty tenements of the poor. A half-block away was the Des Plaines Street Police Station, presided over by John Bonfield, a man without tact or discretion or sympathy, a most brutal believer in suppression as the method to settle industrial unrest. Carter Harrison, the mayor of Chicago, attended the meeting of the anarchists and moved in and about the crowds in the square. After leaving, he went to the chief of police and instructed him to send no mounted police to the meeting, as it was being peacefully conducted, and the presence of mounted police would only add fuel to the fires already burning red in the workers' hearts. But orders perhaps came from other quarters, for disregarding the report of the mayor, the chief of police sent mounted police in large numbers to the meeting. One of the anarchist speakers was addressing the crowd. A bomb was dropped from a window overlooking the square. A number of the police were killed in the explosion that followed. The city went insane, and the newspapers did everything to keep it like a madhouse. The workers' cry for justice was drowned in the shriek for revenge. Bombs were found every 5 minutes. Men went armed, and gun stores kept open nights. Hundreds were arrested. Only those who had agitated for an 8-hour day, however, were brought to trial and a few months later hanged. But the man, Schnaubelt, who actually threw the bomb, was never brought into the case, nor was his part in the terrible drama ever officially made clear. The leaders in the 8-hour day movement were hanged Friday, November the 11th. That day Chicago's rich had chills and fever. Ropes stretched in all directions from the jail. Policemen were stationed along the ropes armed with riot rifles. Special patrols watched all approaches to the jail. The roofs about the grim stone building were black with police. The newspapers fed the public imagination with stories of uprisings and jail deliveries. But there were no uprisings, no jail deliveries, except that of Louis Ling, the only real preacher of violence among all the condemned men. He outwitted the gallows by biting a percussion cap and blowing off his head. The Sunday following the executions, the funerals were held. Thousands of workers marched behind the black hearses, not because they were anarchists, but they felt that these men, whatever their theories, were martyrs to the workers' struggle. The procession wound through miles and miles of streets densely packed with silent people. In the cemetery of Waldheim, the dead were buried. But with them was not buried their cause. The struggle for the 8-hour day, for more human conditions and relations between man and man, lived on, and still lives on. 7 years later, Governor Altgeld, after reading all the evidence in the case, pardoned the 3 anarchists who had escaped the gallows and were serving life sentences in jail. He said the verdict was unjustifiable, as had William Dean Howells and William Morris at the time of its execution. Governor Altgeld committed political suicide by his brave action, but he is remembered by all those who love truth and those who have the courage to confess it. End of Chapter 2.